Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture.
Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. So lucky to be broadcasting to you live here on Radio Karam from the lands of the Eastern Kulin Nation. As always, thank you for joining us on the program for another night of Radio Architecture. My guest and conversation partner this evening is Liam Proberts. He's the Managing and Creative Director of Bureau Proberts, an architecture and design firm with offices in Brisbane, Sydney and London. Liam has over 30 years of experience across Australia, Asia and the Middle East. He led the Australian Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai and is known for city shaping, residential and cultural projects recognised by international design awards and institutions. Welcome to the program, Liam.
Thank you, Ilana. It's great to be here and talking to you from Brisbane, a Yuggera and Turrbal country, up here in southeast Queensland.
It's always amazing to have guests join me from across this huge continent. International listeners may not know we're actually a couple of thousand kilometres away from each other right now at opposite ends and completely different climates. And
a few countries apart in other parts of the world.
Truly. I'm so interested later in the conversation to zoom into some of those regional differences. What makes Queensland architecture so unique and different and special, and the space that you're working and creating in. And you're a listener of the program, so I know you're champing at the bit for my first question. I'll be nice and I will give it to you. What is your earliest memory of a building or place?
Well, it is an interesting question, and I did know it was coming, so it was really great to reflect on it a little bit. And there's really two big memories. My early life was at the Sunshine Coast, so it's definitely about a place. We spent a lot of the time at Alexandra Headlands, which, as people will know, near Maroochydore on the Sunshine Coast, and it's the coastal landscape. We spent a lot of time on the beach and the sand dunes and the landscape of the four dunes, and that's the enduring memory of my childhood, really. Probably too much sun, but it was fantastic. But some of the landscape was changing there at that time as well. There was lots of dredging. There's a place called Pincushion, which was a headland that we'd always walk to up near Maroochydore. People will know that. The water's moved. There were these iridescent green pools that would form and the water was moving. Just an amazing landscape. So that is my first memory of the place.
You mentioned that change over time. It's probably now heavily developed and popular with tourists. Am I correct?
You are correct, but the landscape still resonates. That's why people go there. That's why it is popular. So it's been able to hold on to that because the landscape of the coastal landscape is so strong.
What is your first memory of a building?
Well, I was wondering if that was our house on the at Alex, and it probably was. But really, we moved quite early to Spring Hill in Brisbane. When I was about 8 or 9, and it was a pretty amazing place on reflection to sort of be. We weren't helicoptered in, but to be driven into and living in the middle of Spring Hill, which really was Brisbane's earliest suburb. It was a mix of working class, workers' cottages and hillside grand homes. But at that time, there was also some amazing change happening. We lived across from the Centenary Pool, which is a Jim Birrell, fantastic facility, but also fantastic design. Carl Langer, a bit of brutalist, really, architect for the Main Roads building, right in amongst these little workers' cottages, as well as a lot of other architecture. It was quite a mix, so it was quite a popular place to be in the 70s. So there was a bit of, modern architecture sprinkled in there as well. And it really, it was quite a vibrant place to be in my early childhood. So that really did shape my thinking about what I went on to do.
Why architecture? Had you known any architects?
No, I hadn't. I hadn't known any architects, but I guess I'd always had an interest in and developed an interest in drawing and things, I suppose, not just drawing but things. And but in a funny sort of way, it was going to secondary school down the road up at Spring Hill. I got a little bit deeper into art and had a really great art teacher, Peter Tuckwell, and it sort of uncovered that interest. Probably, yes, I like drawing, but I also like things and solutions. So it sort of started to unfold. But it was a bit funny. I think the first assignment, it's quite lucky with the art program. It was a very new art program in the school, so it was a little bit probably more adventurous, I think, than other schools. And it was quite wide ranging, so we got to look at design and dabble in architecture as well as traditional art. But I think because I'd grown up in Alex and then in Spring Hill, my ideal in my 13-year-old mind of a house was a double brick with a double garage. And so my house was, a brown brick, 2-story, and on a sloping block. I thought it was just fantastic. So when I think, I wish I had still had that model that I did when I was 13, because it was not architecture, but I loved it.
We all trash our first model, don't we? I did the same.
Yeah. But but it did certainly start to get the wheels turning, and that was pretty formative, I think, in the way that my career developed. So it was pretty early on, not long after that, when I thought that architecture was real. And most schools do this now very well, but there was engagement with other architects in the field as speakers, and connections with schools. So it became real and a real option. So pretty early on, I thought that was a pretty good option.
Do you remember when you had the aha moment and you understood finally what was architecture? Often this comes up for students at some point in their undergraduate, sometimes for some later even, where the penny drops and you're like, oh, I get it now. Do you remember that for yourself?
Look, I do remember one. There's many. Like there's no one penny.
Oh, it's a recurring process. It's a piggyback. It's a series of currencies, I suppose, if you want to say it that way. But look, it was later on when you do develop more skills as you get a little bit older, both in craft and thinking and the whole lot. And I started to realise what architecture could be, where you could infuse ideas and self into an architectural solution, and that was pretty exciting to be able to do that and create an expression that was also a functional place. Excuse me. So that was it was either grade 11 or 12. I can't remember exactly when, but I thought, yeah, this is good. I like this. And also, interestingly, some product design at the same time, which had a very similar process and a similar creative process. So I knew I wanted to do something along those lines then. Almost like the Bauhaus model, with architecture at the centre as the mother of all art, and around it you have an industrial design and art practice and all these other creative disciplines that are so close together and are working so close together as a holistic system. That's a quite rare experience in high school education too.
Well, it was rare in high school, I think. Looking back, I didn't know it was rare at that stage, but it was also rare. I then, thankfully, firstly you got to get the marks. So thankfully, I got the marks to get into architecture at QIT, and there was a number of not that many, but there was a number of options around. But QIT, as it was, it's not QUT. It was this was long enough ago to be QIT, but they had there was a Bachelor of Architecture, but also a Bachelor of Built Environment, which had all these disciplines: landscape architecture, industrial design, architecture. So for the first 3 years, you had this very broad, series of connections with these disciplines and other schools as well. You could do electives with the business school, which I did. I found that when I went to visit their workshop where you make the models and you do the tour, and so I just knew that that's what I wanted to do.
I'm really interested in this elective because architects are often derided as not having the business acumen or we struggle sometimes in running practices, not having their business acumen and knowledge, and we're not taught at an architecture school. And as soon as we're given an elective, we probably run off to the fine art faculty and do sculpture or life drawing, as many of my classmates did. And you had the foresight to go and do a business elective. Say more about that.
Well, I did do the communications part of the business elective, as well as normal business. So I think the QIT school created these opportunities, and you made of it what you would. So we did a semester where I did communications, and we did a play, which was fantastic. So that was one side of communications and business that you don't normally get to expose to in architecture. And the other elective was a business assignment, putting a business case together. So I can't actually remember what the business was now, but you had the polar opposites. So that was great. I felt very lucky to have that opportunity. That series of education opportunities. Not quite. You'd have to piece that together today in the education landscape.
What's the biggest lesson you learned during your training that you still hold with you in practice today?
Really good question. It's finding this, whether it's yourself or as a flippant about it. So finding the space to be, centered about that and responsible and creative all at once. If you don't get that space, it doesn't happen.
Is that something you have to guard yourself and protect? Is that part of your routine or how you've built the practice? How do you defend that space?
Yeah, good question once again. Yes, it is something you've got to defend and make happen. But there's so much else you have to do around that. And it's
eternally.
Only when you've done that. Yeah, eternally. And it's when you've done all the research and the analysis, if you like, it almost, you have to put yourself and your practice in a place to distill that. We think that's one of the big jobs that we've got to do. It's what architects need to do. It's around the disciplines or across the disciplines, as well as bringing something else to the process that is not just about the brief.
Absolutely. It's finding that value, that magic, that extra. And it's not giving it away for free because the clients engaged us to create that magic, right? That's exactly our job.
That is our job, and it's different to other disciplines, professional disciplines. It's also different to art, where the artist will create the brief or the really just the concept or an approach. I think architects should all like, and probably do like, having a set of parameters to respond to, but also having a room for a bit of unsolicited, creation as well. And if that's the joy, really.
There's such a funny paradox that happens where the complex brief or the difficult brief, the tricky site, these problems, they give the best results. And then you can have this incredibly famous, successful architect that's had a career of dealing with tricky sites and tricky briefs and complex groups. And then suddenly they get blank slate, open brief, World Stadium, competition, museum, go for it. And it becomes the worst building of their career.
Yeah, there's probably heaps of stories like that. Yeah, so finding that space, I think is probably the biggest lesson, and it is the cut and thrust of the process. I think during education, but certainly in practice, in so much of the cut and thrust that of finding that space to bring it together and be really confident that what you're saying is what we as a group or you as an individual think should be the solution.
When you're in the process of wrangling a brief and you're looking for that space to create, is there something for you that it is a little, kind of North Star that you follow that guides the process or that guides the decision making or helps you know that you're on the right track, perhaps?
Well, it's probably more process than it is a star or a thing. So it is about doing the analysis. What is it about this? What is it, that the brief says? What are the prerequisites? What has this project got to do? Or what has this site got to bring? But then also, well, what is outside that brief? What is our job as architects to recognise and bring to it? Because often the brief writer is not an architect or a design professional, so we like to bring that to it, test it a little bit, with our clients. Say, look, we think this is an opportunity, but you can't do that without doing the analysis or having the experience in a particular sector where you sort of know that intuitively and can form the process. So you've got to go through that. I think there's an advertising book that sort of states it really well. It's How to Get an Idea, and it's about get the information, do nothing. That is, let it distill, because we're all pretty creative, powerful, brains. But it's almost a natural process once you gather that there will be some distillation.
There's a part of your business that works with developers, and often that can freak people out, right? No doubt, both across our industry and outside, people worry that there's not enough space for design, but you have to create that space, as you have shared with us. What's your best lever or best advice broadly in the profession, but also lever that you use in practice to advocate for your creativity and your design ideas, to get them built and bring them into reality in a market that is quite profit driven? Ultimately, the numbers have to stack up.
Yeah, well, look, it's there's quite a bit behind that. I mean, I started in development architecture quite early, in a couple of ways. I began my practice after working with a pretty traditional very good Brisbane firm, Briggs Peterson Burnett, Briggs Peterson Buer. So I had a wide range of experience, but for probably a lot of architects, in the late 80s and early 90s, it doesn't pay very much. So most people did a few private jobs, and those private jobs surrounded either houses or extensions, and sometimes some development. So I had some exposure to development pretty early. And my first job when I went out to start on my own was a development project. So I got to know pretty early that if it doesn't work financially, you don't have a job. And if you don't have a job, you don't put bread on the table. The other projects that I was doing was housing, which I loved. I really enjoyed individual housing, but the development was sort of unloved in terms of design and what it did to the city. I mean, it has such an impact on the city or town or suburb that it really needs to love. And often there's an intersection between that love and value. So I think it's the dance between creating value for the developer, which is often linked to how people want to live or use that development, and they create value. So it's a bit of a chain of value. And in residential development, it's making good places to live and good places that contribute to the city. So they're the sort of, there's not one single answer, but there's lots of influences that really, I really enjoyed about development. And I must say, I enjoyed the cut and thrust of it as well. It's sort of, it is a very active work. So it developed, pretty early as a part of our practice.
Your own projects as well?
Well, yeah, look, yes, we did involve, when I said, I mentioned unsolicited work, it's sort of, we really wanted to hone and understand things more, and also have a little more ability to express things that we thought would work and be good without, having a client body to refer to. So we did take on some development, and probably, in fact, the earliest work when you're talking about putting bread on the table, the Department of Housing back in Queensland back in the 90s would have they put out callings for projects for social housing and affordable housing is now being known. So the architect had to put a proposal in, or if you're up, putting a scheme together and getting a builder on board and putting the whole thing together, which I thought was a really healthy way to bring social housing.
Very Christopher Wren, very master builder.
Yeah, but it worked. I mean, the housing in the 80s and 90s through Department of Housing in Queensland was quite. So that also honed the idea of making a project completely work.
We had a similarly unique climate in Melbourne in the 80s and the 90s that across social housing too, that gave young architecture practices the opportunity to get involved and design these projects and really launch some incredibly famous postmodernist, late modernist and early postmodernist practices that became the international famous stalwarts of Australian architecture that listeners would remember from previous conversations. I'm wondering, was that the similar enthusiasm and optimism that was happening in Brisbane, and could young practices get a go?
Yes, definitely. And we're talking about the early 90s. I started my practice in about 1990, the end of 1990. So in the early 90s, it was a recession. So perfect time to start a practice, as you'd imagine. So, getting work was difficult, but it was also a great time for a government to be investing in construction because the economy was slowing. So there's lots of things that came together, and it was a good time for young practices to engage in this process. So yes, it did help a lot of practices in that time.
I wonder, looking back from your experience, what do you think is so different now to back then that we don't have the same faith and trust in young architectural practices and my dreaded word, emerging practitioners?
Yeah, look, I think it is more complex. The process is more complex. I think 35 years ago we would do the town planning applications because the town planning process was a lot simpler. The financial process of funding a project was really owned by the government, and they were quite a well-structured machine. So that was quite a simple financial process. I think it's now really difficult for an architectural firm to engage in that financial, funding of a project as well as be responsible for the architecture. You really, that's why there's, financiers and development managers involved. So it is a lot more complex to be able to deliver something in that way now, or anything at scale. However, we have done some small developments to test and to satisfy our curiosity, I guess, over the time, and that's been successful.
Do you measure data or do a post-occupancy from those projects to then later use further down the track to communicate the value, coming back to your points from earlier, the value of your work and the value of good design and the value of these good urban interventions, right? Because it's all about people.
Well, yes. One of the projects, we haven't done a lot of developments, but one was called Rowlock, which is a suburb of Brisbane, and we had an idea, and we had a sort of a colleague in real estate that had the same idea that the middle suburbs could do with some smaller, affordable townhouses that that weren't massive, so you didn't have to pay as much per square metre, and a lot of the stuff that was in those suburbs were pretty average. They weren't that good to live in. So we gave that a go, and we wanted to do that project we didn't want to be a developer as such. We wanted to be the architect. So we sort of tried to make it a no-risk development. So we only started once we had things sold. So we had to be able to put them on the market at a pretty good rate so that we could ensure they were sold and have a contract in place so we can develop it at low risk. But that was a good project because it gave a model for a smaller, compact two-bedders, and there was one three-bedder that we did utilise, and I think other people built upon as well.
Do you think more architects should be involved in development or involved in some of these innovations, perhaps in the development model, like Breathe or Assemble, or field work have come up with down here in Victoria. Not so familiar with the Queensland examples that are trying to disturb the process or this system as we've been doing business for a long time.
Yeah, look, I think those innovations in process that Breed and the gang are doing down there is fantastic. It's a different model of development, and it creates different solutions and better places. So yes, I think it's great that is occurring, and hopefully it provides a different model of development that allows more people to be involved. And more architects are able to do it. But they've done a very good job because it is a complex chain to be able to put that together. And I guess success builds upon success. So, I think there's a bit of a separation of powers that goes on when you're a developer and an architect. So I have a lot of respect to be able to change the hats from developer to architect or designer. And then financier. They're three very different things. And so I have a lot of respect for that. Yeah, and I think it's good to see architects engaging in development, but I do think architecture, generally are not developers.
Yeah. I'm wondering, in 35 years of practice, is there a moment that stands out for you that you'll never forget?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and one thing immediately comes to mind, and it's not a development. Actually, we've always engaged in projects, public projects or cultural projects, and we designed the National Police Memorial in Canberra as a competition. We've always engaged in competitions. If I would say one thing, I think it's really healthy for architects to engage in competitions, so that testing that process of going beyond the brief and bringing some of what your own self or thinking to the brief. We've always done that, and we were lucky enough to win that competition for the National Police Memorial, and we worked with UAP, Matt Tobin from UAP, who was the artist that we worked with on the project. And that's sort of different to what we've been talking about in terms of development, because you're responding to a series of feelings that you want to convey in a project, which you do to a degree in development. I think that's what brings, the cultural capital to the city when you're doing a development. It does contribute because people want to feel a certain way about their city. There's an identity about it. But in the police memorial, it was all about conveying feelings of memory and respect, and tragedy. Awareness that everyday people were going to go to work and put their life on the line, and we sort of wanted to uncover what we call the bread and milk, the stories. Someone go home and say, honey, I'm just going to get the bread and milk, and sometimes they didn't come home. It's really getting into that, those layers of feelings, and being able to express them in adult form was a completely different experience, and we've always liked to do both of those things. Anyway, back to the moment. I was sitting there after the inauguration is always the biggest moment in any memorial's life. And I just went back to the memorial the day after and watched people, touching the memorial and experiencing it. And I saw a young girl and her father, walk up to the memorial and touch one of the touchstones or the bronze castings and talk about what happened to this person who was a friend of the father's. And, it was amazing. I felt incredibly rewarded and humbled to be witnessing that moment. And so that was great.
Wow. And to see something so meaningful that you've designed and created, brought into existence, also used in the way you hoped it would.
Yes, exactly. It was to remember people and for them to live on. And that's exactly what that little experience was doing. And, UAP and Matt Tobin working with the touchstones, which the idea of touch became a big part of that memorial. And, the process of bringing that into a built form and making it work was really, really engaging, but also really rewarding. So that's a memory that comes up when I'm asked a question like that.
I love that. What a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that one. Especially, it's a sense other than furniture or joinery. We don't usually or door handles, grab rails. We don't always give enough attention and thought to touch in a project, but it's such a strong sense receptor and such a strong way to engaging with materials. If you look at a common building, the only people touching it are other architects interested in that material or that marble or that timber stroking the wall as we go past, hoping no one saw us.
They stand out a mile away.
That's exactly right. Do you often go back to your projects and, for want of a better word, lurk to see how people are using the space if there's not an official post occupancy? I know some artists really love to do that, lurk around galleries to see how viewers are interacting with their show, for example.
I must say that I don't, and I feel a little guilty about it. I don't return. I mean, I did to the police memorial, and it's actually 20 years this year, so I probably will go back and experience. And I did once or twice, but and I, you get engaged with projects for other reasons, but I don't necessarily go out and dwell or look.
It's hard to go back sometimes when so many years of your life, now listeners will know very well that it's years of architectural time that is spent on a project, are poured into it heart and soul, and then once it's opened, sometimes it's not always easy to return, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think there's a lot of work that goes into putting any building together, but anything of scale, it's years in the making. That's right. And then you're into another project which will also be years in the making. So you take your learnings definitely and bring them forward.
Tell me about Expo 2020.
Yeah, well, look, that was a great experience. It's sort of, I guess, it's akin to the police memorial and the other sort of memorial projects, where we thought we had something to bring. You've got to, for me, you've got to have that feeling like I think we can bring something to this. And I should have mentioned that the police memorial, my father was a copper for a while, so I felt I had an understanding of what it was beyond just being a policeman that that needed to be brought to it. And with the Australian Pavilion, we'd done some work in the Middle East again with UAP. We've done a lot of work with UAP, and we like how they bring an artist's perspective, or in fact an actual artist for us to work with, and we're sort of performing a slightly different role. But because we'd been working in the Middle East, we sort of felt we had an understanding of what it meant to be not just an Australian, but a group of people from somewhere else in the Middle East, and particularly in Dubai, which is such a vibrant culture and it's a very adventurous culture. So we wanted to bring a piece of Australia to Dubai, and that really became our thinking. So that's where that started. And it was a very rigorous and complex process with tight budgets and builders that are in region in the Middle East rather than in Australia. So I think it was a complex project. I think today Oando said it can be an act of violence doing architecture, but there's lots of stuff that goes on. So it was a really challenging but rewarding project.
How would you define Australian architecture?
Really good question. You mentioned that well, you're in Melbourne, we're in Brisbane, and there's Sydney in between. I think there are particularities between the regions, mostly driven by climate, but also by culture and approach to life. So I don't think there's a singular thing about architecture, but I think there is a singular thing about our approachability. I think what is really evident in our work internationally, and it sort of comes home consistently that I think as Australian architects are curious and open. There's a lack of ego, which I think you have to bring a really true creative process together. And we sort of get in and do things, but we're not too precious. So I think they're the qualities that define Australian architects broadly. Well, that's my experience anyway.
How do you feel that it translates into the built form? My suspicion in that sometimes is how we engage with landscape, how we connect indoors and outdoors, how we look for materials that reflect country or reflect the place that we're in.
Yes, I think look, it does. I think there's a frugalness that we display in our architecture. There's not a lot of embellishment. There is, a lot of championing of the actual material and honesty about the material, and we can let that do the work quite well. And I think when that material, I think what you'll see when that material is evident, in the interior and the exterior, there is a melding of those spaces, and I think we're getting better and better at that. And it does define. I think we actually bring that to other places in the world that learn to live with that climate. In the way that we are a little bit more of a benign climate than a lot of places in the world. But when the opportunity is there, if you can design for it, it's a great way to live.
Certainly more benign than the 50 degrees of Dubai.
Yeah. Well, I will say though that we wanted to bring an outdoor space to the Australian Pavilion. The other quality is that we're very welcoming. So we wanted the Australian Pavilion to be the place where everyone felt welcome, rather than, and I think that's probably evident across architecture as well. It's not, it's not threatening. I think we all feel welcome. We're invited into a place. So we didn't have a front door. A lot of the pavilions, you've got to line up and go down a certain route. We ended up calling it the beer gun. Everyone was invited in.
Wow.
And then you were distributed to your place. So that was really the quality that we wanted to bring to.
Yeah, that was
that
fair dinkum kind of mateship flavour that you were effectively describing. Or what I'm noticing in this conversation, that where many will describe physical spaces, you're talking in terms of feelings, and you're structuring the designs and the buildings, the practice that you're building this universe that you're designing and creating out of feelings and emotions that are being drawn to it, instead of behavior and experience or outcome, which I'm listening to with great interest. Yeah,
look, at that spectrum of a pavilion or memorial, it actually begins with the feeling. We wanted to distill what feelings we wanted to convey. It's a prerequisite that we've got to get the function to work. But how is the function going to amplify the feeling and still work?
Yeah, the function's the brief, right? That's the bare minimum.
Yeah, it's the bare minimum. And if you're not meeting the brief, well, you're not doing the job. But how can there be a layer of feeling and in this case connection that we could bring, and in a memorial, make sure that hundreds of thousands of people could experience it, with tens of thousands per day. So there had to be a very functional process that went with it. So that is a prerequisite. But on the other end of the spectrum, it's an interesting question. We do try to bring feelings and create a response from people, whether it's feeling comfortable in their space. But if a project has a job to do in the city, then that is bringing a quality or an identity or a feeling to the city. So there's obviously there's often a dual role, particularly in development projects, because they are contributing to the built form and the fabric of our cities. So, and cities have a feeling. Melbourne feels different to Brisbane, and Brisbane feels different to Sydney. or an identity is another word to put it. So, yeah, that's a layer that we absolutely try to bring to projects.
Absolutely, and it becomes a reciprocal relationship in a way as well. The city will influence the project and activate that space and turn it into a place by having people and life and activity within it, just as much as the building then influences the people in the city and continues to shape and create who we are, as very famously said.
Yeah, well, I think in that way, cities are a reflection of the culture, and the architecture is a reflection of the people. It's true, you know. It's sort of a truism that keeps evolving, but it is an expression of, you know, of a culture. That's what we enjoy about it.
What does good design mean to you?
Well, good design means that, you know, some of the things that we've been talking about, you have made a building that works, that does its job, but that people value that that architecture, and you know, and it endures. And it's endured because it's valued, whether it's beautiful, or whether it has strong meaning, or whether it's enjoyed by people. It's valued, so it's enduring. It's not necessarily what it looks like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because what it looks like in those tastes, they change over time. But when it's valued and it's enduring, to use your words, people look after it, they protect it, and that becomes then true sustainability, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Beauty can be the most sustainable thing, even though creating it might be, you know, more expensive or a little more difficult at the time. If it's beautiful or valued, then it's going to be sustainable.
These conversations are about enduring architecture always, I think, seem to come up around the Olympics, and we've just had the Winter Olympics that folks have been watching, and Brisbane is a hub of activity, full speed ahead in the architecture world up there for the Brisbane Olympics in the next decade, which feels wild to say that we're planning for the 2032 now. Tell us about how this is shaping up. What's the energy in Brisbane right now, and how are you seeing that evolving architectural scene and there's really both the design culture and the building culture and what we're creating for the Olympics?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's exciting. I'm a fan of the Olympics, you know, generally, and the fact that they're in Brisbane, I think, is fantastic. And I think, you know, there's moments in making cities, you know, a series of moments, and this is one of those moments, I think, for Brisbane. You know, you'll hear Expo 88 was also one of those moments. I think it comes in a time for Brisbane where we really are a city now, and we haven't really, you know, caught on to that. We're in a bit of an identity crisis, but because the town that we were doesn't really fit anymore, so we have to adapt. And I think the fact that we've got a big party coming is helping some of the discussions around that, so that we can, you know, be city ready. And the 2032 is going to be a date on the calendar, but it's, you know, 2040 and 2050 that we're really working towards. So I think that's the benefit of it, not only being a great spectacle, I think, you know, and bringing cultures together in our city, but that's going to be its lasting benefit, I think.
What's that inflection point, that fulcrum in your view of when a large town shifts into being a city and takes on that city mindset?
Well, I think we've got to, and I think we are doing this to a degree. We've got to let go of some of the old thinking, a bad phrase, but, you know, some of the constraints and restraints that we had about, you know, how our city is defined, and think about how our city can be defined in 50 years rather than in 10 years. And I think because we've got a deadline, it's forcing those discussions to happen. You know, if we're having an Olympics, how does our city connect with those Olympic venues? How do we deal with the green space? How do we make sure all of these there's some fantastic cultural institutions and places in Brisbane, but they're a little difficult to get to. So how can we use something like the Olympics to create better connections that have a lasting benefit.
And how can we plan for the
Have a
future?
discussion. Yeah,
Right, also these enduring facilities.
Yeah, and that will, foster growth. We are a growing city. There's no getting away from that. And that's one of those things that I think we need to get over a little bit. We are growing. We've got to cater for it. I think we need to be. There's beautiful, precious parts of our city that are steeped in the Queensland heritage, and they need to be protected, strongly protected. There's other areas that we need to let grow in a new subtropical way, a new clean Queensland way. And that can be the identity of the city in, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We've got to find that. I think we're getting along the way.
Reading between the lines there, are you suggesting we need a bit more bravery when it comes to density?
Yes, I think we need bravery, but sort of incentivised bravery. It's not just being brave. For Brisbane in creating an identity, or as you mentioned before, creating a feeling of the city, it's about being brave in a way that connects with Brisbane and the way we live in Brisbane, but the climate as well. And that will have its own identity.
What's the number one thing you'd do for Brisbane if you could wave your magic T-square? What does the city need?
Oh, look, I think our some of the really good cities to be in, and Brisbane's pretty good. Don't get me wrong. I think we've got a lot of things going for us at the moment. The way that we've re-engaged with the river, we are a river city over the last 30 years. It's been great to be a part of that, and we are completely different as a city now than we were 30 years ago, and I think we'll be completely different again. But if we think about our CBD and how our cultural institutions and sporting institutions like the Olympics connect with the city, that's what we've got to do. So if there's one thing we can do, and we can connect our major sporting venues to our CBD.
And some of those inner urban arterial, some of those ways of moving through and having choice of how you move through a city, right? I will, in defence of the transport in Brisbane, say that your water ferries are fantastic.
Yes, they are. They're a journey in themselves, aren't they? They are great.
And such a novelty for us coming from interstate to visit the city to know we can just zoom back and forth across each side of the river and zigzag down. And that is a whole way to experience it there. Another favourite memory of mine is, of course, the cultural promenade by the gallery, the theatre precinct.
Yeah, look, that's right. We're really lucky to have all of that, all those cultural institutions over there on the south bank of the river, which is part of that is a legacy of Expo '88, and it's a fantastic thing to have. Connecting it, we've been better at connecting it over the last few years, so it's pretty healthy.
The other really massive hot topic right now, other than the Olympics, is of course AI, and I'm wondering, given that you work also in the development space, that probably is the one that is on the frontier of being most threatened or most affected by AI, where things can aggressively start getting optimized. And we're not quite perhaps at the point of architecture being replaced by computers, but how are your reactions and thoughts? Are you concerned? Are you engaging with it? Is it a tool?
Yeah, we're engaging with it in a sort of a gentle or cautious way, I should say. I think I don't think that. Well, my opinion is that AI won't replace architecture and the thinking that we were talking about before. Conceptualizing. That is really I think that's where the main value of architecture is, and design and planning. There's a lot of complex.
As you keep sharing with us this evening, the feeling especially.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's where, hopefully architecture, creates and maintains its space. But in terms of efficiency through AI, there's going to be some leaps and bounds there. And we are, as a practice, starting to engage with that a little bit to help us communicate things easier and better and quicker. So that's helping, and it's a pretty tough game architecture. The only help we can get there is welcome. But we're cautious because if it's out there in the world, or you're drawing from the world, it can be pretty messy. So we're trialing it and experimenting, and it's helping. We think there's a great future, and we don't exactly know where it's going to end up. But as you say, it's in efficiencies, and we can all do with some help there.
I think there's this. I'm not sure whether it's an illusion or a looming threat. I'm still on the fence with this one, but the thought that AI will be able to optimize and make a really lean and mean floor plan really, really quickly, do feasibilities really quickly with all these parameters that will effectively, in the lean and mean space, push out some of that love and some of that design.
Yeah, it might push out some of the love. I mean, look, I've got no doubt we're sort of part the way there with efficiencies and planning and feasibilities. But there's you've got to bring, well, I believe you've got to bring your own, or a developer's own, or an architecture's firm's own DNA to that. So you've got to have intervention. It can't all be AI. So there's always going to be a place for people.
I think we talked a lot this evening about value and trying to communicate the value and really bring that across to people. And my feeling is that the best way to get value across, or how to get value across, and we're told that really what I've gleaned out there is that you have to get people to care. What's your best way to get your toughest clients, your biggest objectors, or someone that perhaps was an adversary and became a great support? How do you get people on board, and how do you get that care to increase?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think my initial reaction is that we need to learn what they care about. I mean, our best projects are with our most engaged clients, and you'll probably hear every architect say that. So it's not so much them engaging with us; it's us engaging with them, whether they're a developer or an individual or an institution. So we can get them to care by understanding what it is what's going to be their drivers, and when their drivers align with our drivers, or what we think a project should be, not necessarily what we think as individuals, but what a project should be and what its job is, then you're going to have a client that cares.
Mm. And then there's that magic gap where the delight can come in, the awe, the inspiration, the surprise, where you've hit the brief, you've aligned it, and you've reached something else.
Yeah. Look, exactly. And for us, that's the joy. And for the clients, that's the joy as well. So, I guess our best clients are clients that care about that, and they get that delight and joy out of the process, because that's why they engage architects to bring, well, we believe, to bring something else and bring that value that you're talking about to a project. And yeah, often it's got to be, there's a prerequisite of dollars for a value, money value for a developer client, but they're also leaving a legacy. So, it's most of our clients are very aware of that. So, I guess there is an alignment, and most of our clients care. So, it's not a massive gap, I think. Most people that are up for being engaged and involved in the development and construction or industry, or even the institutional construction industry, care.
Legacy and memory, such powerful levers.
Yeah.
If there's one piece of advice to your younger self, what would it be? Well, I was, your question before about the space, I'm probably giving myself that advice again now, because it is a key thing. You have to bring yourself to so much.
and giving yourself so much, can be really challenging. So I'd say it's remember the space.
The space that you want to work in.
Yeah.
What are your colleagues most dealing with at the moment in Brisbane? What do you think Brisbane's dealing with that isn't caught up in Olympics mania, or isn't involved in that big hype?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think Brisbane's going through a little bit of a social and a built fabric change. Lucky enough to have some great partners and a great team here, and we're the work we're doing and other architects are doing are really changing the fabric of the way Brisbane goes together. We do have an affordability crisis, so Australia does everywhere, and it's difficult to build enough dwellings to meet the demand in that middle sector. And you mentioned projects like Breathe, and they're great. They're contributing to helping solve that problem. But slowly but surely, there's been a move from housing, on large blocks to apartment living. These permanent apartment living in great locations that are well connected to services. It's sort of slowly but surely changing the way that Brisbane is put together and creating much more diversity in our housing, which I think is really, really healthy. It's challenging because we're dealing with projects that are of quite a scale and there's high value and high expectations. But I think it's a really healthy change for Brisbane. And I think Brisbane and South East Queensland is leading the charge at the moment. I think Melbourne and Sydney have led the charge in the past, and there's always been a reasonably healthy options of diversity. But in Brisbane, it really is a new phenomenon, and it's engaging with our good places. It's engaging with the river, making our good places in the city really well held.
It's perhaps also even a challenging shift for the consumer or the resident to shift into apartment living and apartment thinking mindset. I think all across Australia, we're largely resistant to it and are still clinging to the idea of the cup of tea with the neighbour over the picket fence of a small house in a quarter-acre block.
Yeah, well, I think that's why Queensland and Brisbane have been probably last to the party, so to speak, because that we are probably we've got a lot of open space and a lot of freehold lots, so the demand it probably hasn't been as much as other cities, but it's definitely here now. So I think that diversity and density is a really healthy thing.
Well, Brisbane will be the one to watch in 2030 and beyond. I'm mindful of the time, so I will ask my last question, and that is, what gives you hope?
Wow, you asked some very good questions. You said you asked before about how do we make people care, or I forget how you phrased that question.
Pretty much, that's basically it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what gives me hope is that people do care. I mean, I think there's a really healthy care being shown and an enthusiasm about making things better. It's definitely overrides any negativity. So it does give you hope, and the fact we've got such a vibrant architecture and design culture here in Brisbane and South East Queensland, as you do across Australia in Melbourne and Sydney, that gives me hope. It's I think we're going to be okay.
Thank you so much for joining me on the program, Liam.
Thanks, Ilana.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karam studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hi, we're Sledgehammer Honey. You're listening to Radio Karam.
Oi. IGA, it's shopping night. IGA, where the price is right. Seaford North IGA, for your groceries and liquor. IGA Express, there's nothing quicker.